Research suggests that many employees are struggling with too much work, too little support, financial insecurity, a lack of flexibility, and unhealthy workplace cultures. In fact, there are top five concerns that employees have, ranging from work related stress, interpersonal conflicts, underskilled managers, and anxiety around job security and the cost of living. And as I mentioned, a toxic work culture. So, how can employees themselves ensure that these issues don't overwhelm them whilst taking care of their own physical and mental well-being? On this week's episode of a Happier Me podcast, I'm going to put that question to my co-host and good friend, Dr. Manoj Krishna. Welcome, Manoj. As always, let's talk about these issues because obviously we spend an incredible amount of time at work.
Yes. So thank you, Steve. Always a pleasure to do these podcasts with you. And we'll take these issues one by one. Let's talk about stress first. 76% of employees report being stressed. And it's not just a feeling of slight distress in the day. Research is showing that stress, long-term stress, impacts our mental health, our physical health, and is behind many cancers and heart disease, and can shorten our lifespan as well. Now, our mind assumes stress comes from the outside, which in many cases it does. It could be some bullying at work or, whatever. But if we keep waiting for the employers to change, our suffering continues. And this is what happens. Or if my mind assumes my employer or my workplace is responsible for my stress, then I don't think I have any agency at all to manage it myself, you see. And so I just become a victim and my stress continues, my health goes downhill. But it is possible to take ownership of how we are responding to our external challenges. I'll give you the example of a traffic jam. If you're in a traffic jam, our mind assumes it's the traffic jam that's creating our stress. But actually, if you slow it down, two things are happening. There is a trigger on the outside and a reaction on the inside. And it's my reaction to the traffic jam that creates my own stress. Once I see that really clearly, I realize that by working on my own mind, I can train it to respond to the same challenge with much less stress. It doesn't mean the challenge doesn't need to be dealt with, whatever it might be. But my mind is more calm, more capable, and it's able to respond with much greater intelligence, if you like. So I think
this is really interesting, isn't it? I think just for a moment, I think about a lot of the work we do through the Jordan Legacy and the connections we have with businesses and workplaces, and a lot of the talk is around what the workplace should be doing.
yes.
Quite rightly, they should be safeguarding their employees. They should be looking at mental health and suicide prevention policies and strategies in there. But that's only kind of one part of the equation, isn't it? As you've rightly said, there's a lot we can do to mitigate the the harm sometimes that is caused by workplace cultures. So I think this is a really important conversation for us to be
Absolutely.
having today.
Yes, because if I wait for in the meantime, you see, my health is being damaged. My mental health, physical health is being damaged, and I'm just waiting for things to change on the outside. I complain and complain, but nothing's changing. So really, it's up to me to take ownership of my own stress. And I can with this approach, just realizing, and of course, the Happier Me app has lots of resources to help people with that. Which is not to say that somebody else is not to blame and somebody else doesn't need to change, but it's saying you can take ownership because quite often, Steve, our stress is created by our own thinking, and we're not aware of that. So in the app, you'll find 15 ways our own mind creates our own stress. So for example, I'll give you one example. We're always looking for external validation, right? In order to feel good about ourselves, I need Steve to say, well done, Manoj, for Manoj to feel good about himself. But once I realize that doesn't make sense, Steve is busy thinking about other things. He doesn't have time to think about me. And so I can then start taking charge of my own self-worth, see? And then my stress related to that can dissolve. So, like that. Or, for example, my mind is comparing all the time and I'm not aware of that. So, someone else gets, the boss says, well done to somebody next to me. And I suddenly start feeling this pain of envy, oh my God, I'm being left out or whatever. And just realizing that this process of comparison doesn't always serve me, then allows me to compare when it serves me. See? So, like that, there are many ways in which understanding our own mind can contribute to us living with much less stress.
We're trying to unravel a kind of an inbred human nature here, aren't we?
Yes.
That as we've been looking for validation since the moment we were born, really, as
Yes.
human beings. That validation initially from our parents, and then as we move to school and teachers and our peers. So there's a bit of unraveling to do here, isn't there?
It's just understanding. It's just shining a light. So my friend John Brooks used to say, Manoj, this is like walking into a room and putting the light on, but the light goes on in your own mind. And it begins with self-awareness. Just understanding what our mind is doing to us and what's going on in our own mind. And that understanding puts us in charge and gives us choices on how to respond. Oh, one more tip is when we are stressed, our mind zooms into the problem, right? So suppose I lose my job, then my whole life becomes a failure, right? And then, as you know, a lot of people, based on these big triggers, will often commit that's the wrong word. Think of suicide or whatever, right? Self-harm. So one thing we can all do is to zoom out of situations consciously. So when you're stressed, zoom out of situations and realize actually my health is good. I've still got loved ones in my life. You know, I'm breathing okay, and so on. And then, okay, this problem is in perspective, right? I've lost my job. I'll get another one, and so on. So the mind always zooms into problems. And one way of dealing with stress is to zoom out and regain perspective. Just a small tip.
It's interesting, isn't it? 76% of employees are saying they feel work-related stress, 66% experiencing burnout. And if we just take one example of, constant deadlines expected of people within the workplace, or always expected to be on.
Yes.
This is something that's happened in the digital world, hasn't it? The fact that we're expected to respond almost 24 hours a day, or at least we expect that we should respond, maybe. And I'm wondering if that's some of the key to this, is that managers, and we'll talk about this in a moment, maybe aren't being considerate enough about when they send communications and when they expect people to respond, i.e. emails arriving at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. But we also put pressure on ourselves, don't we, by thinking we should reply
Yes.
then. So this about stepping back and looking at it differently, as you've suggested then?
It's just saying, how can I look at things differently? Is what can I do? What can I do to respond differently? So maybe it means realizing that the bottom 20% of my to-do list will never, ever get done. And the moment I realize that, then the pressure of deadlines seems to kind
I
of,
think I'm reaching that point. It might be
yes,
nearer 30%, but
yes, it
yeah, I
just
think I'm reaching that
evaporates.
point at the moment.
Do you know what I mean? And I think lots of enlightened companies are now saying to workers that you don't need to respond to emails after this time and so on. But I think it's all about just a balance because it's not if I'm an employee of a company, I have to also realize the pressures that companies are under, bosses are under, right? And companies are folding every day. And if the company folds, my job goes. So it's taking a holistic view. So employees taking the needs of the company into account and employers taking the needs of staff into account. So it's a partnership, I think. And I think this idea that it's us versus them, that I think is unhelpful on both sides.
Absolutely. I mean, you've mentioned this, but it's a partnership, but we also talked about managers and bosses, and let's talk about one of the second biggest concerns there is conflict within the workplace, but particularly a sense that poor management exists, that there isn't the support that they should be. And let's talk a little bit about that employee-employer relationship, which is a huge factor in terms of
Yes,
work-related stress, isn't it?
absolutely. Because see, the key to leadership, whether you're a manager or on the executive board, is self-awareness and emotional intelligence. So if you need to lead somebody else, you need to begin by leading yourself, being in charge of your own emotions, your relationships, your stress and anxiety, and being aware of. So if there are pressures coming from the top, do you just automatically pass them on unfiltered to everyone else? Do you operate from a culture of fear to get things done? Are you sensitive to the needs of people because they change every day? People are turning up. Are you empathetic? How can you get people to work for you without fear? You see, that's the key thing. Because when people are afraid, they don't perform.
And do you think this kind of management by fear is often led by just a lack of good education for managers? Sometimes they don't know how to lead effectively, so by default they go to this management by fear
Yes.
process.
I mean, of course, it's easy, right? So default is easy. I've got the power. I can wield it. I can fire you. I can shout at you. I can do whatever. But you won't last long as a manager. 50 to 60% of leaders are failing within 2 years because they don't have these skills. And inside HappierMe, we've built detailed self-awareness, emotional intelligence programs to help leaders. So in fact, I had a conversation with the number 5 in the British Army, and I said, his name was Mike Butterwick, and the podcast is in the app. So I said to Mike, what's the number one quality you feel leaders need? And he said, it's self-awareness. So even in the British Army, this is being recognized now as a really important piece in the toolkit. But think, Steve, of our education in school or college. Where was self-awareness taught? Nowhere.
No, not at all. It's interesting. I'm casting my mind back some years now when I was a director of a leadership and management training company, and the principles we would coach to managers were based around John Adair's action-centered leadership, and within that approach was the recognition that there were kind of three sets of needs, really. That there were task needs, how well a manager communicated and the tasks that needed to be done. There were the team needs. Essentially, a manager needed to recognize what the team required to function as a team. And then there were the individual needs, what that individual employee needed in order to be able to thrive and perform in the workplace. And so much of that was around, good communication skills, but recognizing that each employee was different and each employee had a set of very personal individual needs that if you met them as a manager, you were likely to get the very best out of them. And I wonder sometimes if some leaders and managers have too much of a blanket approach to managing their teams and don't consider the individual needs, which I think in recent years have become even greater as we look at things like ADHD and neurodiversity and other elements that were never talked about before. A manager's role is quite a tough one, isn't it, really, now,
Yes.
if you're going to satisfy those individual needs?
So you need to have such great self-awareness because then you need to respond to each person where they are. A Gen Z person, for example, is going to be totally different to a 50-year-old in terms of what their particular needs are. And as you say, to get the best out of them. And I think communication is a real art that we've never been taught and few people master because only 20% of communication is verbal. All the rest is tone, your energy. So if you're stressed and flapping, that's what your employees are going to pick up no matter what. If you suffer from anxiety, your employees are going to be anxious. It's going to be picked up. And all of that diminishes performance. Stress, anxiety, fear, all of that diminishes performance. So you need to create that culture where everyone can thrive. And to do that, you need to be thriving on the inside as a start, right?
So I suppose the question I've got, Manoj, is around anxiety. It's one of the areas, as I mentioned, that HappierMe app looks at and provides some really great resources on. What are your thoughts around some of the issues that lead to anxiety in the workplace?
The thing is, Steve, that anxiety is really common. It's about 40% of people. And you can see the factors around it, right? Job insecurity. And it may not even be the companies who are responsible because the world events are changing. You know, America introduces tariffs suddenly and the company and so on. So there's no shortage of external factors that create anxiety. And they may not always be work related. Could be my children are having a hard time. My relationship is in trouble, and so on. My health, I've got concerns about my health. So, how can we, as individuals, manage all these uncertainties and remain emotionally stable? That's the key question, right? Because I may deal with one challenge today, but tomorrow another three will turn up that create anxiety. So, the key thing to realize is anxiety is an automatic reaction from our thinking, right, to the possibility of something bad happening in the future. So it's worth reminding ourselves, number one, that I'm okay right now, right? That's number one. Because if I'm not okay now, there's a challenge I have to deal with. But most anxiety is in the future. That's number one. I think the second thing is to ask yourself, if that happened, what would I do next? If I lost my job, what would I do next? And so on. So if you can accept that you will have the capacity to deal with whatever happens when it happens, then your mind stops worrying. See, that's the other big thing that we can all take charge of, ourselves.
And I think it's really interesting because if you know what you're saying there is kind of breaking it down to, am I okay today? And all right, what might this lead to? But it might lead to this. How would I deal with that? We don't do that naturally as human beings, though, do we? We tend to accumulate these worries about the future to the point that we catastrophize. And at that point, the anxiety becomes overwhelming and clinical, potentially
Yes.
as well. So, what I'm hearing you say is it's about kind of mentally breaking it down, even if you write it down, I suppose, as well.
Journaling
How,
is so
if this
good.
did happen, how would I deal with it?
And so the third question could be, how likely is it to happen? Like you're getting on a plane. How
Yeah,
likely
great
is it to
question.
fall out of the sky?
Yeah.
Am I imagining the worst, which you probably are? And are some things inevitable and just have to be accepted? Like, I'm going to die one day. I mean, if you're I was in a school and these 18-year-olds, I asked them, what's your number one fear? And it was a fear of dying, Steve. I said, does that mean you're going to spend the next 70, 80 years of your life in fear? What's that going to do to your quality of life? See? So I think anxiety is something that our mind generates to try and keep us safe. But sometimes it gets out of control and it stops being rational and really interferes with our well-being today, you know?
I can remember listening to a tape by the motivational speaker Anthony Robbins many years ago, and he used an acronym, FEAR, FEAR, and he said basically what it is: it's false evidence appearing real.
Yes.
And yeah, this is why it's so important to question what it is you're anxious about, what it is you're worrying about, and some things may be inevitable, as you say. But actually, is this real, or am I catastrophizing and thinking the very worst? So yeah, really interesting.
Yes. So, for example, the way I deal with anxiety is whatever happens, we'll deal with it. You know, because, when you are a parent and you have kids and they're doing things in the world, sitting exams and going hang gliding or whatever they do, and you always worry about what's going to happen to them. And what stopped me worrying is saying, okay, whatever happens, we'll deal with it.
Well, maybe anxiety is one of the areas when we have a quick look at the HappierMe app soon. Maybe that's one area to explore. But I want to talk a little bit about interpersonal conflict. This was another big area, one of the top five concerns for employees. What's going on there from your experience?
So it's two-thirds of employees complain of interpersonal conflict. Bullying is about 1 in 5 in most organizations. And I think the art of relationship, Steve, is the most difficult art for human beings to master. We're not good at that, are we? Because so many factors are involved in that, in developing a healthy relationship. Our self-interest, our emotional needs, the tone of our voice, whether we've how stressed we are that day. If I've had an argument at home, I come into work, I'm gonna, shout at anyone who whatever triggers me. So I'm much more easily triggered. Past trauma. If I've suffered past trauma, I'm much more likely to be easily triggered. And of course, there are people who have bad relationships or challenging relationships all around, and they blame the other person, but not realizing the common denominator in all of that is them. So I think all great. I mean, here are a few tips, but the app has many, many more tips for. I think the first is to learn to listen deeply. And I've got one little tip, which comes from the Lakota tribe in North America, which says, and they have a custom where someone's speaking, and when they finish, you don't speak immediately. You pause. And then you ask a question, not jump in with your whatever. So what did you mean by that? Or can I ask you about this or so on? And just the act of feeling deeply listened to. That's one. I think the second tip I would offer is to try and understand what the person's feeling. What's the emotion behind the words being spoken? It might be very simply, on the surface, a discussion about something simple in the office, but underneath there's so many other layers, past hurts and resentments and all of that. And I think we have to all examine our own self-interest as well. In all organizations, my department versus your department, my organization versus yours, me versus you. And we need to realize we're part of the same ship sailing in the same direction. So just a few thoughts there, but also to realize that we have to take charge of our own happiness. The longer the list of our expectations of others, the more disappointed and hurt we're going to be, right?
It's difficult though, isn't it? I mean, I think about even the projects that I'm involved with and the initiatives there. You constantly have expectations of others, and I find myself battling at times by, one of our values, is about compassion, and humility and respect and trust, and these are all core values we operate by at the Jordan Legacy. But I find myself instinctively being frustrated by how other people don't respond or behave. And then almost as a backup now, my default is to go, well, they may have something going on, something's going on for them. And I think that's only born out of my own lived experience of Jordan's death and, a very different viewpoint in the world. But it's kind of our default always is to have expectations of others, isn't it? So again, not an easy thing to change, I'd suggest.
The first step is to write down, to become aware of what expectations we do have. I think that's one first step because many expectations are buried. We're not even aware we have them. Then now you've got your list of 100. You can examine those expectations and say, how many of these are reasonable? If people had those same expectations of me, what would I think? So that for me takes out 80% of them. They're just gone.
That's a great piece of advice. Really like that. Yeah.
Then when there are 20 left, then rather than demanding things, we can then communicate them with care. So if I don't communicate that, Steve, I have this expectation of our friendship and relationship, and I expect you to read my mind, it's not going to happen,
Yeah.
right? And I'll just walk away and I'll get hurt, angry, walk away, and you won't even know what's happened. And so many relationships break down. So I think being able to communicate our relationships not as a demand, but as a please, could you, that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just really interesting listening to everything you're saying here because, I think back to my days of leadership and management coaching and training. But I'm just thinking, how many companies, would benefit from this kind of thinking and an approach? But it's never trained, it's never coached to the
No.
managers or the employees at all. And again, I think the benefit of the Happier Me app within companies is could make a real difference. Going to take a look in just a moment or two, but there is one other area that, again, was within that top five list of things that were causing stress to employees in the workplace. And it's a big one, really, because it's about being part of a toxic or unsupportive workplace culture. So this is the whole culture now of the
Yes.
business. How do you deal with that?
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because everyone expects somebody else to do something about it. You know, and if you're at the top of the organization, you think, well, what the hell am I going to do? I've got 10,000 people working here, and so on. So I think it begins from the bottom up and top down. Top down is to create a culture where there is less fear. There is accountability, but there isn't this constant fear. A culture of kindness, see, and to emphasize that kindness is important in the smallest things. Can I get you a cup of tea? I'm going down to the cafe, or yes, whatever it might be. Oh, I did this for you. I came across this and I thought you might find it helpful. The smallest acts of kindness. How was your day? How was your holiday? So I think management training is important. So managers need to lead with less fear, more empathy, more kindness, softer communication. How you're spoken to makes such a difference, right? But I think bottom up's also equally important. That means I, as an employee, am going to contribute to that culture. Am I coming to work with my own happiness to share with people? Or am I coming with an empty bucket, hoping everyone's going to fill it to make me happier? Okay. Am I coming to work with a positive attitude? Because, of course, there's always going to be negatives to focus on. But am I going to come to work with a positive attitude? Look at the positives. I'm really grateful I've got a job. I'm not there's so many people who are unemployed. And for example, or I'm doing meaningful work, or my company's doing meaningful work. Or how can I support colleagues? How can I support Steve so that he shines and does? So if I adopt a positive attitude, my life changes because everyone now thinks, great things of Manoj, and I'm happier. I'm not thinking negative things all the time, but I'm also contributing then to a positive, to changing that culture. So each person contributes to the culture. One person who's negative with a negative mindset, constantly moaning, is going to drag that whole culture down, right?
I mean, this makes so much sense, doesn't it? We sit here talking about it. I'm sure there'll be people listening to this now nodding and going, well, that makes perfect sense. And then there'll be somebody saying, well, okay, well, I'll be kind when someone's kind to me, which means that we never move forward. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it is top down, it's bottom up, working collaboratively, but it has to start somewhere, and we can contribute as an employee just as much as we can have expectations of the employer to make that change as well. I think these are really important points, Manoj. Look, we've mentioned the Happier Me app. I think it'd be a good time, as we always do in these podcasts, to kind of dip in and just make people aware of what's available. We never rehearse this, so I'm not sure where you're going to take us on this particular
Okay.
journey
Well, there's
today,
a
but I
lot
know it'll be
inside the
relevant.
app. Yeah. So let's do that, Steve.
It'll
Let
be
me,
very relevant to what we've talked about today, I'm sure. So,
yes, yes. Let me give me a second. Okay, here we go. So this is the HappierMe app, and this is the main dashboard. So I'm just going to point people to the different parts of it. For example, we've got a really big work and leadership section, and all the things we've been talking about are here. There's stories on burnout, a Feel Better Now section on stress and anxiety, short videos on how to be happier at work, for example, or be free of prejudice or deal with stress, and much more detailed guided programs on work, how to be happier at work, for example, or develop your leadership skills using self-awareness and emotional intelligence. Because that is something that can't be taught in a classroom. You have to teach yourself that every day through daily habits and practices. And we've got an online journal. There's a really big communication module and talks about listening, speaking with care. Like, before I speak, am I going to pause and ask, how is this person going to receive it just now, today? Is this the best time to tell Steve that I'm not happy with him, or shall I wait until tomorrow, for example, when he's in a better mood? And so on. So how to have difficult conversations or problems in communication. Um, and there are other modules on bullying. Most people who bully others are not aware that that's what they're doing. They're not aware of the impact. So self-awareness can help with that. How to have happier workplace relationships, make better decisions. Dealing with critical feedback is so challenging for lots of young people now. And employers really value that skill. So they want to be able to say something and the person to receive it in a really positive way. Or kindness in organizations or inclusion. Inclusive companies are 35% more profitable. McKinsey research shows that. So there's a lot of work there. The number of podcasts on wise leadership, decision making, a positive mindset, people management, and so on. And of course, a library of all our past events. There are also many blogs on how to stay motivated at work, or how can organizations reduce workplace conflict, boosting well-being and productivity, and so on. So, and that's just our work and leadership module. But you have we have a mental health section where you have detailed programs on stress, anxiety, depression, and so on. So a lot of content there. There's an online journal, community forum for conversations, and you can talk to a coach there as well. I hope that's a very quick tour, Steve. Just
yeah,
to say
no,
that
no,
a lot of content for all the issues we've discussed today.
very much so. And I'm going to ask you a question in a moment that I haven't asked before, I think, around the app, because, I'm sitting there looking at it. I know the app, been involved, I've known you for some time now, and just marvel at just how much information there is and the content that is available. One of the challenges with apps sometimes is that people tend to go to them when they need them. And I'm wondering if you've got any tips in terms of how to get the best from the Happier Me app, particularly if you're an employee or an employer. Take either one or both. How would you suggest they make best use of that app? Is it?
Steve, you worked in suicide prevention now for a long time, right? And the work for suicide prevention needs to begin when the sun is shining, right? Not in the middle of the storm. So similarly here, we brush our teeth every day to invest in our dental health. So you need to do something every day to invest in your mental health. And what the HappierMe app offers are daily practices and habits that you can then make part of your life, whether it's breathing exercises, self-awareness, or just learning about anxiety. Imagine if I could learn about anxiety before I became anxious. I could prevent it, you see.
Yes. Yeah.
Learn about stress before. So HappierMe is prevention focused. So the more you understand and learn about yourself and develop these practices and make them part of your life, the more you can prevent all those problems from occurring. And I think that's the key differentiator that we're bringing to the table, prevention.
Definitely. And I would say to any manager listening, get involved with the app, go in there, learn from that app, and take that learning back to your company and employees. You'll without question change as a manager, for sure, and people will recognize that. Manoj, thank you. For everyone listening, the HappierMe app is available via HappierMe.app. It's also via the Jordan Legacy's website, where you'll find our podcast on the radio show and podcast link at thejordanlegacy.com. Manoj, as always, thank you. Just fascinating conversation. And I'm sure people are going to take a lot away from this. For anyone who is watching via the YouTube recording here, please do leave your comments on the YouTube video underneath there. And as I say, you can access via the jordanlegacy.com website via our radio show and podcast this show and previous shows, 6 previous episodes now. This is episode 7. And as I mentioned, if you'd like details about the HappierMe app and how to access it, you can do through the Jordan Legacy website, where we offer a special discount code as well for Jordan Legacy followers to access the app. So thank you to everyone who's watching and listening to this show. Manoj, thank you. We'll be back again next month for another episode and another topic around how we can all become a happier me. So for now, thank you, Manoj.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.